A brilliant but overlooked paralegal stands before the Supreme Court, forced to defend a law that her harshest critic doesn't realize she wrote herself. Will Eleanor Walsh finally receive recognition for her genius, or will Justice Montgomery succeed in dismantling her life's work without ever knowing its true creator? Eleanor Walsh's hands trembled as she opened the cream-colored envelope bearing the Supreme Court seal. Her small apartment kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the wall clock and her daughter Sophie's pencil scratching against homework paper. Could this really be happening to someone like her? "Mom, what's that letter?" Sophie asked, looking up with curious eyes. Eleanor took a deep breath. "The highest court in our country needs me to come explain a law." "Wow, that's amazing." Sophie's face lit up with pride. Eleanor didn't have the heart to tell her 10-year-old daughter that she'd been summoned merely as a procedural specialist, someone to answer basic questions about paperwork. The Supreme Court had no idea they'd called upon the very person who wrote the Mitchell Privacy Act from her kitchen table over countless midnight hours. "When do you leave?" Sophie asked, twirling her brown ponytail. "Next Monday," Eleanor replied, glancing at their refrigerator covered with Sophie's drawings and school achievements. "Mrs. Carter will stay with you." The television news droned in the background, legal experts arguing about the Mitchell Act. "This amateur legislation threatens industry standards," declared one commentator. Eleanor bit her lip, fighting the urge to shout back at the screen. For 3 years, she'd hidden behind the name E.M. Mitchell, sending her groundbreaking digital privacy framework through anonymous channels, knowing a paralegal without a law degree would never be taken seriously. Now her creation faced judgment by 9 Supreme Court justices, including the formidable Richard Montgomery, who'd publicly called her law simplistic nonsense created by someone who clearly failed Constitutional Law 101. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. Her boss's name flashed on the screen. "Eleanor, what's this about you going to Washington?" Marcus Reynolds demanded without greeting. "I've been summoned as a specialist for the Mitchell Act hearing," she explained. "This is ridiculous," Marcus snapped. "The partners wanted to send Jeffrey. He has the credentials and appearance this firm expects for Supreme Court matters." Eleanor gripped the phone tighter. "The court specifically requested me." "Well, don't embarrass us. Stick to the procedural questions. Leave the real legal work to the qualified attorneys." After he hung up, Eleanor stood silently by the window, watching rain streak down the glass. Sophie approached, wrapping small arms around her waist. "You're the smartest person I know, Mommy." Eleanor hugged her daughter, wondering what Sophie would think if she knew the truth, that her mother had crafted legislation now being debated nationwide. That night, after Sophie went to bed, Eleanor opened her worn laptop. Dozens of folders contained 3 years of research, drafts, and legal precedents forming the backbone of the Mitchell Act. She clicked through her work, anxiety building in her chest. What if Justice Montgomery tore apart her creation while she stood silently by, forced to hide her authorship? Eleanor closed her eyes, remembering how it began. Sophie coming home crying because a classmate had used her photo without permission, creating a cruel online joke that went viral. No existing laws had adequately protected her daughter's digital rights. So Eleanor had created one. As dawn approached, Eleanor packed a simple navy suit and sensible shoes into her suitcase. She tucked a worn copy of the Constitution inside, the same copy that had inspired her to craft a law protecting Americans' digital selves as fiercely as their physical ones. In 5 days, she would stand before the highest court in the land, pretending to be a simple assistant while 9 justices decided the fate of her life's most important work. Justice Richard Montgomery's black robes billowed behind him as he strode into the Supreme Court chamber. Heads turned and voices hushed at his arrival. At 69, with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes, his reputation for intellectual brutality had reduced seasoned attorneys to stammering wrecks. Eleanor sat at the specialist's table, her hands folded neatly over her worn leather portfolio. She felt painfully out of place amid the polished marble columns and rich mahogany panels. Her navy suit, purchased from a department store clearance rack, stood in stark contrast to the bespoke attire of the attorneys surrounding her. "That's who they sent as the specialist," whispered a law clerk to his colleague. "Montgomery will destroy her." Eleanor pretended not to hear, focusing instead on controlling her breathing. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as the 9 justices took their seats, Justice Montgomery settling directly across from her position. "We begin examination of the Mitchell Privacy Act," announced Chief Justice Williams, his voice echoing through the chamber. "The court calls upon the specialist to explain Section 4.3 regarding digital footprints as personal property." Eleanor approached the podium on legs that felt disconnected from her body. Justice Montgomery didn't look up from his papers, a clear dismissal of her importance. "Your Honors," she began, her voice steadier than she expected. "Section 4.3 establishes that personal data created through everyday digital activity constitutes property owned by the individual user rather than the platform collecting it." Justice Montgomery's head snapped up. "And how exactly does this square with established precedent regarding user agreements?" His tone dripped with condescension. "User agreements that citizens willingly sign?" Eleanor met his gaze. "The section acknowledges those agreements but reframes them as limited licenses rather than transfers of ownership." Montgomery's eyebrows shot up. "Reframes? The law doesn't reframe established contract principles because someone finds them inconvenient." Several spectators chuckled. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks but maintained her composure. "The section builds upon Justice Holmes' dissent in Olmsted, Your Honor. The makers of our Constitution undertook to secure conditions favorable to the pursuit of happiness. In the digital age, that pursuit requires ownership of one's digital self." Montgomery's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting you understand Holmes better than this court, Ms. Walsh?" The chamber fell silent. Other justices shifted uncomfortably. "No, Your Honor. I'm suggesting Holmes might understand this law quite well." Justice Abigail Carter coughed to hide a smile. Justice Montgomery's face darkened. "Perhaps a practical demonstration," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Approach the bench, Ms. Walsh." Eleanor walked forward on wooden legs. The other justices watched with mixtures of curiosity and discomfort. Montgomery slid a legal pad toward her. "Explain the constitutional framework making Section 7.2 viable given its direct contradiction of United Digital versus California." Eleanor recognized the trap immediately. The case he referenced was obscure, known primarily to privacy law specialists. She'd studied it extensively when drafting that very section. 30 seconds, Ms. Walsh," Montgomery pressed, checking his watch with theatrical flair. The young law clerks exchanged pitying glances. The Solicitor General winced visibly. Eleanor straightened her shoulders. She knew this answer, not as someone who had memorized it, but as someone who had created it. United Digital relied on market participant doctrine, Your Honor. The Mitchell Act deliberately bypasses that by invoking the Fifth Amendment's takings clause instead. She continued, outlining a legal pathway that left several justices leaning forward in their seats. Montgomery's face remained impassive, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "And where did you study constitutional law, Ms. Walsh?" "I didn't complete law school, Your Honor. Family circumstances intervened." His smile was cold triumph. "Yet you stand before the Supreme Court, instructing us on constitutional interpretation?" "I stand answering questions about a law I understand deeply, Your Honor." "Do you?" Montgomery's voice grew louder. "Then defend Section 12 in its entirety. Without reference materials." The courtroom froze. Section 12 was the most complex in the entire Act. 57 subsections of intricate legal reasoning. Justice Levinson leaned forward. "Richard, this is inappropriate." "I accept the challenge," Eleanor said quietly. As she began speaking, even Montgomery's stern expression gradually shifted to reluctant attention. Eleanor felt a strange calmness settle over her. For the first time in her professional life, she was being truly seen, even if no one yet realized they were witnessing the architect rather than the assistant. Eleanor's voice filled the Supreme Court chamber as she navigated the complexities of Section 12, her words forming an intricate legal tapestry that held even Justice Montgomery captive. Court reporters frantically typed, struggling to keep pace with her detailed explanation of digital consent boundaries. Subsection 12.34 creates a three-tiered approach to tacit consent, she continued, moving from memory through the very words she had crafted at her kitchen table while Sophie slept. This prevents companies from burying permission in user agreements. Montgomery's eyes narrowed. He glanced down at the text before him, then back at Eleanor, suspicion darkening his features. Ms. Walsh, these explanations appear rehearsed. Almost as if. As if what, Your Honor? Eleanor asked, heart hammering against her ribs. As if you're unusually familiar with the author's thinking. A dangerous moment. Eleanor kept her expression neutral. I've studied the Mitchell Act extensively, Your Honor. Justice Abigail Carter leaned forward. Ms. Walsh, your interpretations align precisely with the legislative intent. That's remarkable for someone who merely studied the law. Whispers rippled through the gallery. Eleanor felt invisible walls closing in around her secret. Montgomery set down his papers with deliberate slowness. Where did you work before becoming a paralegal, Ms. Walsh? I raised my daughter, Your Honor. I was a single mother. And before that? I attended Westridge Community College. I didn't finish my degree. Montgomery's laugh held no warmth. Yet here you stand, explicating constitutional theory that challenges minds with decades of legal training. Eleanor squared her shoulders. Knowledge isn't exclusive to elite institutions, Justice Montgomery. The chamber fell so quiet Eleanor could hear the wall clock ticking. Montgomery's face flushed crimson. Your Honor, interjected Justice Levinson, perhaps we should focus on the law rather than Ms. Walsh's background. The law is precisely my focus, Montgomery replied, not taking his eyes off Eleanor. Section 15 contains a reference to Blackstone's property rights philosophy that's notably similar to an obscure article I wrote 20 years ago. Hardly coincidence. Eleanor's mouth went dry. He was right. She had read his article, had even admired its vision despite disagreeing with his conclusions. Well, Ms. Walsh, Montgomery pressed, how do you explain this remarkable similarity? All eyes turned to Eleanor. She could feel her carefully constructed world beginning to fracture. Great legal minds often reach similar conclusions independently, Your Honor, she replied carefully. Indeed. Montgomery's smile didn't reach his eyes. Though usually those minds have comparable training. Justice Carter shuffled her papers. We're straying from procedure. Let's return to Section 16 regarding algorithmic transparency. Montgomery ignored her. Tell me, Ms. Walsh, who is E.M. Mitchell? The question lanced through the chamber like lightning. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the podium edge. How could he know? The law's attributed author, Your Honor, she answered steadily. Yes, but who are they really? No legal scholar has claimed authorship. No congressional staffers. No one from the major privacy advocacy groups. Eleanor maintained eye contact despite her racing pulse. Perhaps they prefer their work to stand on its merits rather than their credentials. Or perhaps, Montgomery replied, his voice dropping dangerously low, they lack credentials entirely. The Chief Justice cleared his throat. Justice Montgomery, we have substantive legal questions to address. Montgomery nodded, but his eyes never left Eleanor's face. Indeed we do, Chief Justice. Indeed we do. As Eleanor returned to her seat, she felt Montgomery watching her, not with his earlier contempt, but with calculating reassessment. She'd survived this round of questioning, But instinct told her the real battle was just beginning. Back at the specialist's table, her phone vibrated. A text from Sophie. "How's it going, Mom? Are you teaching those judges about our law yet?" Eleanor's hand froze. Our law. Sophie had always called it that, never knowing how true it really was. Tension crackled through the marble hallway outside the Supreme Court chamber. Eleanor leaned against a column, breathing deeply to steady herself while court officials bustled past. 10 minutes until the session resumed. 10 minutes to prepare for whatever Montgomery might throw at her next. Ms. Walsh. She turned to find Justice Abigail Carter approaching, her petite frame belying her formidable presence. "Your Honor." Eleanor straightened immediately. "Walk with me," Carter said, not a request but a command. They moved down a quiet corridor, their footsteps echoing against the polished floors. "You've impressed several of my colleagues today," Carter said quietly. "Not an easy feat." "Thank you," Eleanor replied cautiously. "Montgomery is on a hunt. He believes you know more than you're admitting." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "I'm just doing my job, Your Honor." "Ah, you." Carter stopped, fixing Eleanor with a penetrating gaze. "Because I reviewed the Mitchell Act last night. Something struck me as peculiar," the distinctive voice threw out. "Most legislation passes through dozens of hands, becoming a patchwork. This reads like one person's vision." Eleanor remained silent, unsure how to respond. "My clerk discovered something else," Carter continued. "The original draft was submitted through anonymous channels traceable to West Hill Library, 3 blocks from your apartment." The floor seemed to shift beneath Eleanor's feet. "Many people use that library." "Indeed." Carter studied her face. "Why hide, Ms. Walsh? If you contributed to this legislation, why not claim credit?" Before Eleanor could answer, a court official approached. "Justice Carter, Chief Justice Williams requests your presence. We reconvene in 5 minutes." Carter nodded. "We'll continue this conversation later." As the justice walked away, Eleanor fought rising panic. Her secret was unraveling thread by thread. Returning to the chamber felt like walking toward an execution. The gallery had swelled with spectators, word having spread about the unusual procedural specialist holding her own against Justice Montgomery. The justices filed in, Montgomery last among them. He carried a slim folder that hadn't been present earlier. "Before we continue examining the Mitchell Act," the Chief Justice began, "a procedural matter requires attention." Eleanor's heart sank. It has come to the court's attention that certain anomalies exist regarding the law's authorship. He nodded toward Montgomery. "Justice Montgomery has information to present." Montgomery opened the folder. Court researchers examined submission records for the Mitchell Act. The digital signature uses encryption methods described in the Act itself, an elegant closed loop. Murmurs spread through the gallery. Eleanor stared straight ahead, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Furthermore," Montgomery continued, "the Library of Congress records show research materials for the Act were accessed using an ID card registered to a Mitchell Walsh. An interesting coincidence given our specialist's name." All 9 justices turned toward Eleanor. The chamber held its breath. "Ms. Walsh," the Chief Justice said gently, "would you like to address these findings?" Eleanor stood, legs surprisingly steady despite the earthquake occurring in her personal universe. The moment she had both feared and secretly longed for had arrived. "Your Honors," she began, her voice quiet but clear, "I can explain." "Please do," Montgomery said, triumph evident in his tone. Eleanor took a deep breath. "Mitchell is my maiden name. My daughter's library card shows both names, Eleanor Mitchell Walsh." Relief spread through Montgomery's expression. "So you maintain you have no connection to the Act's authorship?" Something broke inside Eleanor, years of hiding her brilliance, of watching less qualified men take credit, of diminishing herself to make others comfortable. "I didn't say that, Justice Montgomery." Confusion crossed his face. "Then what are you saying, Ms. Walsh?" Eleanor looked around the courtroom, at the legal scholars who had dismissed her law without knowing its creator, at the tech company lawyers who had fought to overturn her protections, at the justices now hanging on her every word. "I'm saying that sometimes the answer is hiding in plain sight," she replied, strength flowing into her voice. "Just like Section 4.1 of the Mitchell Act states that truth often exists where we least expect it." Montgomery's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "You're claiming—" "I'm not claiming anything yet, Your Honor," Eleanor interrupted. "But I believe the court deserves the complete truth before rendering judgment." The Chief Justice leaned forward. "Ms. Walsh, are you E.M. Mitchell?" The question echoed through the chamber. Eleanor felt as though her entire life had been building to this crossroads. "Before I answer," she said carefully, "I would ask the court, would it matter if I was? Would the law be judged differently if written by a paralegal rather than a professor? By a single mother rather than a seasoned legislator?" "This court is adjourned for 1 hour," announced Chief Justice Williams, his gavel crack echoing through the stunned chamber. "Ms. Walsh, you will join us in Conference Room 3 immediately." Cameras flashed as Eleanor followed a court officer through a side door. Reporters shouted questions that bounced off the marble walls. She clutched her worn portfolio to her chest like a shield. The conference room felt suffocating. 9 Supreme Court justices and Eleanor arranged around a gleaming table that reflected their faces like a dark mirror. No clerks. No assistants. No witnesses. "Let's dispense with the circling," Justice Montgomery said, breaking the tense silence. "Are you E.M. Mitchell?" Eleanor looked at each face surrounding her. Some curious, some skeptical, Justice Carter's almost encouraging. "Yes," she said simply. "I wrote the Mitchell Act." Montgomery's fist struck the table. "This is outrageous. You've made a mockery of these proceedings." "I've done nothing illegal," Eleanor replied calmly. "The submission process allows for pseudonyms." "Why the deception?" asked Justice Levinson, his elderly face troubled. Eleanor unclenched her hands. 3 years ago, I submitted a privacy framework to Senator Blake's office under my own name. His aide replied that while my ideas were charming, they would need a qualified legal scholar to develop them properly. She placed her portfolio on the table, opening it to reveal hundreds of handwritten pages. "So I became E.M. Mitchell. I created an anonymous email, submitted through proper channels, and suddenly those same charming ideas were revolutionary." "But you're a paralegal," Montgomery insisted, as if her job title alone invalidated her abilities. "I'm a paralegal who has spent 20 years studying privacy law," Eleanor countered. "I read every Supreme Court decision on the subject while my daughter slept. I taught myself constitutional theory between loads of laundry." Justice Carter leaned forward. "Why not pursue law school?" "My husband left when Sophie was 2. She needed health care. Stability. Law school doesn't provide health insurance for your child." Eleanor's voice remained steady. "So I became a paralegal instead of a lawyer. But I never stopped learning." Montgomery stood, pacing behind his chair. "This is unprecedented. A non-attorney crafting legislation now before the Supreme Court." "The Constitution doesn't require a law degree to write laws, Richard," Justice Carter pointed out. "Many congressional staffers aren't attorneys. But they work under supervision." Montgomery's face flushed red. "And who supervised the drafting of the Bill of Rights?" Eleanor asked quietly. "James Madison wasn't a lawyer." The room fell silent. Chief Justice Williams cleared his throat. "Ms. Walsh makes a valid point." Montgomery's eyes narrowed. "This doesn't address the procedural deception. You were called as a specialist, not the author." "I was called to explain the law," Eleanor replied. "Who better than its creator?" "Your lack of formal training," Montgomery began. My lack of formal training allowed me to see solutions others missed, Eleanor interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. I wasn't constrained by conventional thinking. Justice Fitzgerald, who had remained silent until now, spoke. The Mitchell Act approached privacy from an entirely fresh perspective. Perhaps that's why. Montgomery shook his head. We cannot possibly proceed now. The case must be reheard with proper disclosure. Why? Eleanor challenged. Does knowing I'm a paralegal rather than a professor change the constitutional merits of the law? Of course it. Montgomery stopped, realizing the trap in his own thinking. Chief Justice Williams checked his watch. We must reconvene shortly. The question before us is procedural. Does Ms. Walsh's authorship materially affect our review of the Mitchell Act? The law should stand or fall on its merits, Justice Carter said firmly. Justice Levinson nodded. I agree. The creator's credentials are irrelevant to constitutional review. Montgomery's jaw tightened. He stared at Eleanor across the table. You deliberately concealed your identity. I revealed my expert knowledge openly in this very court, Eleanor replied. You simply assumed I couldn't possess it. The silence that followed hung heavy in the air, broken only when the Chief Justice stood. We reconvene in 10 minutes. Ms. Walsh, please return to the specialists' table. We will address this development in open court. As the justices filed out, Montgomery remained, gathering his papers with sharp, angry movements. Eleanor moved toward the door, but his voice stopped her. You made me look like a fool. She turned back. That wasn't my intention, Justice Montgomery. Wasn't it? His voice was bitter. The paralegal outsmarts the great judicial mind? Eleanor shook her head. This was never about outsmarting anyone. It was about creating a law that protected people like my daughter. For a moment, Montgomery's hard expression wavered. Your work is not without merit. Coming from him, it was nearly a declaration of brilliance. Thank you, Your Honor, Eleanor replied quietly. She walked out, spine straight, heart pounding with the knowledge that regardless of the court's ultimate decision, her voice had finally been heard. Cameras clicked rapidly as Eleanor took her seat in the courtroom. News of her revelation had somehow leaked. Journalists frantically typed on phones while spectators whispered behind cupped hands. The gallery had filled beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls. A text message lit up Eleanor's phone. Mom, you're trending. What's happening? Sophie had attached a news headline. Mystery author of Privacy Act revealed in Supreme Court showdown. Before Eleanor could respond, the marshal's voice rang out. The Honorable, the Chief Justice and the Associate Justices of the Supreme Court of the United States. Oh yes. Oh yes. Oh yes. The 9 justices filed in, Justice Montgomery last among them. His eyes briefly met Eleanor's, giving nothing away. Before we continue these proceedings, the Chief Justice began, we must address an unusual development. The court has confirmed that Ms. Eleanor Walsh is, in fact, the principal architect of the legislation under review, having written it under the pseudonym E.M. Mitchell. Murmurs cascaded through the chamber. After consultation, this court has determined that while unusual, this circumstance does not invalidate our proceedings. The law itself remains unchanged regardless of its authorship. Relief flooded through Eleanor. At least they would still consider her work on its merits. The Chief Justice continued, Ms. Walsh, you will remain as specialist of record, but with your authorship now acknowledged. Justice Montgomery leaned toward his microphone. I request permission to continue questioning the specialist about Section 18. Granted, nodded the Chief Justice. Montgomery shuffled his papers, a new intensity in his bearing. Ms. Walsh, Section 18 creates an individual right to control algorithms processing personal data. What constitutional basis supports this novel approach? The question was precise, targeted, not dismissive as before, but challenging on substantive grounds. This wasn't Montgomery the bully, but Montgomery the judicial scholar. Eleanor straightened. The Fourth Amendment protects citizens from unreasonable searches. Modern algorithms perform continuous searches of our digital lives without warrant or probable cause. But users consent to these algorithms, Montgomery countered. Do they? Eleanor responded. Can you name every algorithm currently processing your data, Justice Montgomery? The average American cannot. Section 18 simply requires informed consent, not implied consent. For the next 2 hours, Eleanor engaged in sophisticated legal dialogue with all 9 justices. No longer hiding her depth of knowledge, she cited cases from memory, explained her reasoning process, and defended her innovative approach to digital rights. When Justice Carter asked about Section 23's impact on national security cases, Eleanor outlined the careful balance she created between privacy rights and legitimate government interests. I drafted 6 different versions before finding the right balance, she explained. The current language acknowledges both values without sacrificing either. Montgomery, who had been taking detailed notes, looked up. You considered national security implications without consultation with intelligence agencies? I read every publicly available brief from those agencies, Eleanor replied, including your own work from when you served as an intelligence counsel, Justice Montgomery. His eyebrows raised slightly, perhaps the closest thing to respect he'd shown. As the session concluded, the Chief Justice made an unexpected announcement. The court will deliver its decision in 2 weeks. Additionally, he paused, looking directly at Eleanor. The Judicial Conference has expressed interest in consulting with Ms. Walsh on future digital privacy standards. Stunned whispers filled the chamber. Such recognition for a non-attorney was unprecedented. Outside on the Supreme Court steps, reporters clustered around Eleanor. How does it feel to have your identity revealed? Shouted one. Will you continue your legal work? Called another. Eleanor spotted a familiar face pushing through the crowd. Sophie, accompanied by Mrs. Carter, their neighbor. Mom! Sophie broke through, throwing her arms around Eleanor's waist. Everyone at school saw you on TV. My teacher said you're making history. Eleanor hugged her daughter tightly, cameras flashing around them. I was just trying to protect you, sweetheart. Ms. Walsh. The crowd parted as Justice Montgomery descended the steps. Reporters fell silent, cameras turning toward this unexpected confrontation. Justice Montgomery, Eleanor acknowledged, keeping one arm around Sophie. I owe you an apology, he said, surprising everyone. I made assumptions based on your title rather than your abilities. That was inappropriate. Eleanor nodded, understanding the enormity of this public admission from such a proud man. Your law has flaws, he continued, but its core principles are sound. More than sound, they're necessary. Is that how you'll vote, Justice Montgomery? Called out a reporter. Montgomery's stern gaze silenced the question. He turned back to Eleanor. The court has received an unusual request. Yale Law School has inquired about your interest in their accelerated program, with full scholarship. Sophie gasped, looking up at her mother with wide eyes. And my clerk position becomes available next term, Montgomery added. The court can make exceptions for exceptional circumstances. Eleanor stood speechless, Sophie clutching her hand. Consider it, Montgomery said before turning to leave. He paused, adding quietly, the law needs minds like yours, Ms. Walsh. Not despite your unconventional path, but because of it. 2 weeks later, Eleanor and Sophie sat in their small apartment, watching the television as the Supreme Court announced its decision. By a vote of 7-2, the Mitchell Privacy Act was upheld. Justice Montgomery, writing for the majority, cited the Act's innovative constitutional framework and necessary modernization of privacy concepts, the news anchor reported. Sophie bounced on the couch. "You won, Mom. Your law won." Eleanor smiled, tears threatening. "We won, sweetheart. Are we moving to New Haven now?" Sophie asked, referring to Yale's location. "Yes," Eleanor replied, still amazed by how quickly life could transform. "And next summer, we'll go to Washington for my clerkship." Sophie hugged her mother fiercely. "I always knew you were smarter than everyone. Now they all know too." Eleanor kissed the top of her daughter's head, thinking of the long journey from hidden talent to recognized voice. She had stepped out of the shadows, not just for herself, but for every person whose brilliance had been overlooked because they didn't fit the expected image. The phone rang, Justice Carter calling to congratulate her. On the coffee table sat admission papers for Yale Law School, alongside an employment contract for a Supreme Court clerkship. A decade of dreams fulfilled in 2 extraordinary weeks. "Eleanor Walsh, Supreme Court clerk," Sophie practiced saying. "Eleanor Walsh, future justice." Eleanor laughed. "One step at a time, sweetheart." But for the first time, those steps seemed possible. All because she'd finally allowed the world to see the truth, that brilliance comes in all forms, even a simple woman in a navy suit with a worn leather portfolio and a mind that had changed the law of the land.